share my screen. Alrighty, can you see my slides? Yep, okay, cool. So today, thank you for joining everyone. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about coral reef sort of geomorphology, looking at the islands that are on these kind of features. And I'm going to present some initial results on a stability and susceptibility index that we're trying to work out to try to figure out the inherent stability, instability, and maybe climate pressures that are going to be put onto the islands in various locations around Australia. So jumping straight into it, I'll just quickly talk about reef sediments because obviously the islands themselves are made of those. So it's good to remember that when we're talking about coral islands, the sediments that are on reefs are typically created from shells and skeletons from different calcifying organisms. So we're thinking things that are reef framework, fragments of coral and coralline algae, shells of foraminifera, which are these guys over here, and mollusks, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, geological time, we have this sort of production of sediments, and eventually we get this sort of formation of sedimentary features. So we have sand aprons, which are these areas here. We could have lagoons that are sandy lined lagoons, and coral islands as well. And it's important to note that in a coral reef system, sediments make up to around 90% of the physical volume of a reef. And that's, I guess, because the geological evolution would mean that sea level would rise and the sediments would build up as you go. So just to highlight one sort of aspect with the sediments that are a bit of an issue for coral reefs is that we can have some calcifiers that are more sensitive to environmental change. And I've given an example here, which are foraminifera, which are these single-celled guys on the left. And I've given you an example here of Rain Island on the Northern Great Barrier Reef. And they've done surveys there and found out that the sand on that island is actually made up of 40% or 40+% by these little critters. So if we think that they're actually going to be really susceptible to pH or temperature change, what's going to happen if we lose that kind of species? Are we going to lose a considerate amount of sediment budget in these sort of environments? And really the take home from this slide is that the contributions of the different biological contributions to sediment are unknown at a lot of locations because they are so remote. Okay, so we know this is just a cross section of a reef, and we've probably seen this schematic done to death, but effectively we have sort of waves that arrive at the edge of a reef over here, and we have massive amounts of wave dissipation and attenuation over the edge of the reef crest. Anyone who's a surfer amongst us will know that just like a sandbar on a temperate beach, reefs cause a barrier or a natural breakwater, and we can have a lot of dissipation there. And then there's the knock-on effects for sediment transport. So generally that is onshore towards the inner back reef environments, but there is some out of the way. And importantly, we have this production of sediments that can then accumulate on reef flats to create reef islands. So for this talk, we need to make sure that we're considering that reefs are actually an eco-morphodynamic system. So we have those biological compositions, components, we have physical components as well. So we have the production of carbonate, the processes that move that carbonate or that sediment around, as well as the sort of chemical processes. So those three together, just as in any geomorphological system on a temperate coast, changes to islands or coastal plains, etc. So just remember that those are sort of the aspects that we're thinking of today. So what do islands look like? So they're a diverse bunch. So you get some that are made of sand, some that are made of rubble. We can have some that may be vegetated, some that aren't. Depending on the reef type, you might have, for instance, a motu, which forms on sort of an atoll reef. You might have, mangrove or wooded islands as well. So straight away you can tell, and their shapes and sizes also vary quite considerably. So if we take that into consideration, we can already tell that there's pretty big diversity in islands themselves. And if we look at islands up close, we can tell that some of them, but for instance, maybe their vegetation is an indication of their longevity or their evolution, maybe they're older or younger, et cetera. And we can have beach rock forming, which kind of lithifies things. So there's a lot of sort of geometric features within an island that we can use to maybe tell the inherent stability, instability of an island to maybe a climate threat. Yep. Okay, so distribution. So probably best to start off with how many people rely on coral reefs and their islands worldwide. So that number has been sort of put at about 200 or 200 plus million people around the world. And I've just put a statistic here that atolls and platforms, which are sort of the standard type of reefs that islands grow on, are sort of distributed across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and there's a couple of examples in the Caribbean. But sort of largely, if we look at the distribution amongst the Indian Ocean basin, we can see we have about 1,400 islands across that sort of basin. And we have around similar sort of number across the Pacific, including the Great Barrier Reef and other sort of features and all of the typical low-lying islands that you would consider like Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, French Polynesia and all those kinds of ones. And I might just point out another area that also has quite a lot of coral reef islands, and that is the South China Sea region, which has around 250 islands in there. And obviously the islands in that region are quite a political hot potato at the moment because of the sort of overlapping ownership disputes between various neighboring nations. So their formation, typically we know that they kind of formed from about 6,000 years ago when sea levels sort of stabilized at their current sort of levels, and sort of processes that form them. We know that we have the waves that will, so if we have a wave crest going across a reef, we'll have various wave transformations, convergent, etc. And we'll have these sort of sedimentary bodies forming. They may be stable or unstable based on the shape of the reef or what material, if it's sand or shingle, etc. But they will actually be different processes or evolutions for different reef types. So I've given you also an example of an atoll reef where this paper in 2019 showed that there's an initial sort of rubble formation from storms. Then you have a following of sort of sandy stuff on top. Then we get sort of to sort of sea level, and then we can have a lateral progradation. So islands in themselves can be quite different in how they form, and then that shows us a lot of different types of islands. So this is a paper that came out this year that I was also involved in, and that was looking at Rubble Island dynamics using One Tree Island in the Great Barrier Reef as an example. And what we found through various sort of LiDAR and surveys and bathymetric surveys, etc., is that these sort of rubble spits sort of formed on the reef flat, and over time they sort of migrated and added rubble to the island. And we could see that the volume actually increased by sort of 7% over 40 years because of longshore sediment transport and wave overtopping. But what was really interesting with this Rubble Island was that the sort of major changes in the shoreline location or the spit locations was really associated with cyclone proximity and ENSO phases. So the sort of day-to-day movement was happening based on sort of sediment transport and overtopping, but the big sort of changes was happening because of cyclones. Sorry, one sec. Okay, so we've all seen this Kench figure multiple times, but basically it shows island change and island size on the x-axis and the change on the y-axis. And basically we can see that although large islands have the largest change here, it's actually percentage change is biggest for the really small islands. And that's what interests me, because a lot of my islands that I look at are smaller than sort of 10 hectares. So those are the ones that are going to be the most variable. But even if islands are not changing size, they may be changing shape or location. And that may have knock-on effects for the people that live on these islands, for example. And we might have an island that's migrating across a platform. It might be rotating because of storms. It might be merging with other islands. So even if the size of the islands themselves are not shrinking, or maybe they're growing, the locations are, and that becomes a bit of an issue for those people who rely on them. And just another paper that I sort of thrown in there is this is a plot of island size through time from the Ryukyus in Japan. And it shows here that following a massive bleaching event, the island actually had sort of a spike in island size, obviously more rubble and dead coral arriving at the island, creating more island, but then that sort of plateaued off after. So maybe storms are going to cause a short-term increase in size, but maybe a long-term sort of reef health is going to become an issue for islands. So we know the typical threats to islands. We have sea surface temperature, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and storm tracks. But what's interesting is that these sort of threats are happening more often together at the same time. which may be causing compounding effects to the reefs themselves and the reef health, and then knock-on effects to islands. So remember that the reefs supply the sediment. So without the sediment, what might happen to the islands? Are they going to become unstable, or are they going to drown potentially if sea level rise? So these are the kinds of things. We need to quantify the sort of environmental parameters around different locations. Okay, so in the future, much debate. Basically, there are sort of two sides of the debate. Are they going to be destroyed by climate change, or are they just going to adapt? Are they going to use that accommodation space to create more reef, to create more sediment? And basically, what can be boiled down from the future of coral islands is that if the reef itself can continue to produce the sediment, potentially that might ward off any kind of susceptibility or maybe vulnerability of an island if it's still receiving sediments. But if the life system or the reef system suddenly becomes less productive, is that going to then mean that there's less sediment arising? Then we might get this sort of less sediment, we might get islands migrating and then even getting destroyed. And from a social sort of perspective, I also added this Stolazzi paper, which showed that the sort of inhabitability of coral islands may be significantly less. They might be sort of 2050 instead of 2100 if we're having overwash processes that are inundating freshwater aquifers, which means that people can't live there. So all these sort of things moving together, kind of creating a picture that if the reef itself is damaged, maybe that's going to have a knock-on effect. But then different locations are going to respond differently. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but we'll try and drag out some themes here. So what I'm working on is looking at islands that are actually classified under the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea as a coastal state sort of baseline. So a baseline under international law is basically where a state, so let's take Australia as an example, will draw a line around its mainland coastline and then measure 200 nautical miles from there. But if you have coral islands that sit sort of around Australia, but further than that, you can then use that as a baseline as well to extend those 200 nautical miles and even further. So what maritime zones look like is basically there's various different, you've got your coastal waters and your contiguous zone and et cetera, but it's the exclusive economic zone that's the one that dictates what you can do. So that's mining, fishing, et cetera, shipping channels and all that kind of thing. So, and then I was talking about the islands before. Basically, this is a little island here and this is your mainland. If you have an island sitting out here that you have an island on that you claim, you can extend this yellow or orangey area way further than 200 nautical miles from the mainland coast. So obviously that's going to have huge geopolitical implications for many places in the South Pacific, but also other places like France and other ones that use these features to delineate their exclusivity. So when it comes to island baselines, it's a bit different to a continental baseline. And how that is because under the law, the whole reef is considered one feature with the island on it, as opposed to just the island being the shoreline. So when you look at a reef structure, it's that low astronomical line around the reef that forms the baseline. So I've given you an example here. So this is Cocos Keeling Islands, which is out in the Indian Ocean, which is the territory of Australia. And you can see the orange line is the baseline that is around the edge, the low water line of the reef, and the red lines are where the islands are. But you can see here that we have a huge amount of area that is claimed as Australia's exclusive economic zone. So these are the kind of reefs that I'm looking at to try and figure out if we can quantify how vulnerable they may be to future climate change. Because if we have a loss of islands, we need to have under the law, we must have an island that is inhabitable or economically significant for it to be classified as a feature that can have a baseline and those maritime zones. So if it's not classified as that, then you can't claim it as exclusive area. So this is this is the Pacific, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge right there. But what you can see is, this is an example of a coastal baseline around a sort of of a reef. But if we are to add sea level rise and suddenly this line is no longer the low water line, we're going to have to redraw our baseline, possibly around the island along here. So it's an atoll-y sort of feature here. And that's obviously then going to have a shrinking of the associated maritime zones. And for small Pacific Island nations that may have territories and fishing rights, etc., which rely exclusively on these sort of areas for their economic survival, it's quite an important thing to think about. But a lot of things to consider are that all these coloured lines here, where adjoining maritime zones, they're done through treaty. So I'm not talking about those ones in this example because they are usually done on a country-country basis and done through the international court, etc. Okay, so the dilemma, we know that the islands are very different and their geomorphic characteristics are different, and they might have inherent stability differences if they're vegetated or not, etc. And they're also exposed to different climate pressures. And we obviously know that they're important. So we need to find a way to identify the processes that may dictate the instability or vulnerability of an island and also characterize the pressures that might be put on different locations. So my research is looking at a bunch of different islands, which I'll show you now. So there's three main regions that I'm looking at. We've got the Cocos Keeling Islands, which I've previously shown you, the Northwest Shelf of Australia, which has a number of coral islands. And the main one, which has the most islands, is the Coral Sea Territory, which lies east of the Great Barrier Reef and extends Australia's jurisdiction many, many hundreds of kilometres towards the Pacific. So we can see we've got atolls and platforms, other platforms and sort of horseshoe-shaped atolls. This is Lihu over here, which is the biggest atoll in the world. It's about 100 kilometres long, 20 kilometres wide. Mellish, which is the most offshore in the Coral Sea, and various other islands that also are in different sort of states. So you can see that they're really diverse and that these islands actually supply about 15% of Australia's exclusive rights or claims to territory. So if we were to lose those, that's quite a large, sizable amount of area that we may lose rights to. So you can see that the islands are all very different there. Okay, so our approach, it's a work in progress, I must stress. COVID threw a bit of a spanner in the works with our lockdown, but yes. So our methods here, we want to quantify the instability, quantify the climate, and then combine two scores based on a number of variables into one nice sort of rating or score of susceptibility. So we'll do this through, this isn't a new idea. This has been sort of done loosely in the Pacific before by Nunn in 2015. And we've taken their sort of idea of looking at a bunch of variables. I've just shown you 3 variables here. And then they will be looking at various things that happen, and you can then class each. So, okay, let's look at area. So if the island is larger than 100 kilometers squared, you give it a rank of 1. But as we know, if the islands are really small, they're potentially more susceptible to change. So you give that a higher rating. So we've taken this sort of premise and applied it to the various islands I showed you on the previous slide. So the data that we're working with is we have a bunch of aerial imagery, topography and bathymetry, and other sort of GIS data sets. So we can really sort of look at the islands from a sort of and quantify various things on the islands, like the shape, the location, the vegetation, etc. But then we also have climate proxies that we can pull out from various locations. So we have sea surface temperatures, we have ERA5 waves for the last 40 years, sea level rise, pH, surface pH, storm history, and also marine heat waves, which obviously affect the biological components of reefs. So we can take all of these and we can give the locations a ranking for each parameter. So just to pull out a couple of examples of climate proxies, I pulled out the storm tracks that I got from 1956 to now. And you've got tropical storms here, category 1 all the way to category 5. And you can see straight away that sort of the Northwest Shelf and the Coral Sea tend to get a bit more storm activity than some of the sort of more higher latitude areas down here. So instantly we can go, okay, well, we know that storms may change islands, so maybe that's something we should investigate. And then I pulled out sort of the thermal stress, which is called degrees heating wheat index. And I've pulled out 5 mass bleaching events that have occurred in the world You know, we probably heard of the 2016, 2017, and even 2020 events. But you can see here that this is a rating of accrued heat stress. So at 4 weeks of above average temperature, you can start to see coral bleaching. At 8, you start seeing mortality. So anything that's yellow is sort of bleaching. Anything at orange is sort of magenta color is mortality of coral. And we know that that can have a knock-on effect to the sort of sediment supply to islands. So building on the Nunn methodology from before, I've just pulled out a couple of island parameters we were looking at. So I've modified the thresholds between the things, the different parameters. But for instance, if we look at elevation, most of these islands are very low. So I've created, if an island is less than 1.5 meters above sea level, that's probably going to give it a high score for that parameter. But if it's higher than 6 meters, it gets a low one. So we've done that for all of our, we have 10 parameters that we looked at for the islands. And we have 10 parameters, which I'm only showing you a couple because otherwise it'd be too busy. So there's 10 for the island and 10 for the climate parameters. So another one of these is like marine heat waves. If there's been no heat waves, we give it a low score. If there's been a ton of heat waves, we give it a high score. So it's a fairly sort of simple way of looking at it, but we can then pull out these numbers really nicely. So the rationale for the breakpoints is based on literature or a nice sort of gradation across the data we collected at different locations. So we have our 10 variables. So the potential is that we're going to have 5 times 10 equals 50. So the highest score we can get is 50 for the island itself. And the highest for the climate is also 50 because we had 10 at 5 ratings each. So hopefully everyone's following, but it'll make more sense in a moment. So we take those 2 scores and now we can compare those. So on the y-axis, we have our island susceptibility, and on the x-axis we have our climate. So the example would be if you had a low susceptible island and a high climate susceptibility, you would have a moderately vulnerable island. Or if you had a high and a high, you'd have a very high sort of susceptible island. So it's kind of a simple way of doing that to try and, it's a risk matrix, I guess, like the talk we saw earlier. Excellent. So alrighty, so I've done this for all of the islands, but I'm just going to give you a regional level sort of assessment, just so it's a bit sort of malleable with everybody. So we have our 4 regions, the Cocos, Northwest, Coral Sea, and the South Coral Sea. And we have our wave climates, which sort of vary. We have variable storm frequency, marine bleaching events. We have mortality events, pH relative to global average, and we have sea level rise rate based on the global average as well. And it's a a traffic light system. So look at the colors, we can instantly see that the Northwest Shelf is a lot higher in a lot of the categories compared to our sort of Cocos Keeling or even our Southern Coral Sea area. So maybe the climates in those areas are going to be more or less pressuring on the islands themselves. We did the same for the islands themselves, and I've just pulled out a couple of nice examples. So we've got different island sizes, remembering that the island size is better, the bigger the better. The elevation, the higher the better. Circularity, so if it has sand spits or not, we know that that can relate to movements in the shape and the size. If they're vegetated or not. And if they have a proximity to other islands. So if there are other islands around it, then maybe there are other reefs. Maybe that means it's going to be more protected from various waves or storms. And the location on the reef. So you can see that we have the same color coding. So Scott Reef in the Northwest isn't doing too well on all of those categories compared to, say, Cato Reef, which is in the South Coral Sea, which is doing all right, sort of thing. So instantly you can kind of see we're pulling these sort of trends together. We're sort of characterizing the different areas and the islands themselves. But what does this actually mean? So let's look at all of the islands now on that sort of matrix. So we can see we have a couple of examples around the outside, but most are in the middle. And what we're doing, so we can see there's sort of a normal distribution, about 10% on either side, or either high or low. But what we're really trying to figure out now is what do these susceptibility classifications actually mean? Like, what does a moderate classification mean for all of them? Does that mean maybe they're going to be stable? Does that mean they're going to last longer potentially? Or how, yeah, so that's what we're still trying to figure out in the analysis at this stage, but there are some patterns. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at a high and a low rated island and just sort of characterize the conditions there to kind of make it more tangible for everyone to understand. So Scott Islet, you can see it just here in the middle there. It's more sort of like a sand spit but it's been there for a while, so they classify it as an island. And then Cato Island just here, which is a nice vegetated island. And you can see we have a moderate and a high classification and a low and a low. So instantly we know they're a bit different. So hopefully, so red or orange relates to the orange in the graphs and the green as well. So small island versus a big island, low island versus a higher island. One's more circular than the other. One has vegetation, one doesn't. So instantly you can see that they're very different. And when we go to climate proxies, we can see that in the Northwest, in the Scott Reef, we have way more storms and a higher category of storms. So Cat 4 compared to a Cat 0 or tropical storm, and more bleaching history as well in those areas. And again, we have Scott Reef has a higher rate of sea level rise and a lower pH. So maybe the environment there is a bit more hostile to the reef itself. So maybe that makes it inherently a bit more unstable. So what does that look like spatially? So we've done this for all of the islands. So we've got our 3 regions as we have here. And you can see that Scott Reef, which is just here, is our sort of high susceptibility. We also have some high susceptibility islands here in Lifu, and they're on an atoll reef. Actually all of the islands that are high risk are on atoll reefs. And that might also relate to the fact that they're on narrow reefs and they're more exposed to waves potentially. But they also have quite high storm activity and heat wave history. And we've gone through that as well for our Cato. But you can also see Elizabeth Reef, our high latitude reef, is also a low risk. Some of the Cocos Keeling Islands, which are larger and more vegetated, also have that sort of classification. So that's sort of the initial results of what we're doing at the moment, but I thought I would also talk about what we want to do, how we want to refine the methodology a bit, and also the next steps. So we've kind of thought that a really good idea would be to maybe reanalyze all of the data we've done, but maybe weight the analysis. So maybe give certain parameters or metrics more of a weighting. So is island height and vegetation more important than maybe the surrounding substrate or other sort of features or the shape and things like that? So we want to rerun the analysis to see if we can really focus in on that and better define those classification types. What do they actually mean in sort of tangible ways? The second thing we want to do is look at a decadal analysis to try to follow on what's been done in the Pacific Islands. And what we're going to do, I'm going to do a sort of shameless plug for one of GA's, Geoscience Australia's new portals. So they have this historical aerial photography archive that launched a couple of months ago. This is a picture of it here, and you can see the areas that are covered. And a lot of the imagery is just, you click on it and you can download it straight away. And we're going to just do a standard shoreline analysis and then look at that through time. And so that will then link into the final thing we want to do, which is define the future timelines for susceptibility. And how we're going to do that is we're going to pull out the brand new sort of IPCC high and low scenarios at our certain locations and characterize what the conditions and the climates are going to be like at our sort of locations. And basically all that sort of links back in to, if we lose one of these islands, are we going to lose not only the reef itself, but are we going to lose the maritime jurisdictions around it? Are we going to lose other sort of cultural and social aspects that go with that? So yes, the take homes are, we know that islands are diverse and they're exposed to a number of different pressures. We've presented this sort of idea of a matrix or a susceptibility index, and we've sort of identified some regions and reefs that may be under threat more than others. And basically, to ensure that islands survive, we need to conduct further research into the sediment compositions. I said earlier at the beginning, some of these species that provide sediment to islands are sort of sensitive. And we need to figure out some more nearshore wave modeling and things like that, and physical measurements on reefs themselves, and also to identify further sort of biological chemical threats to islands. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.